Karen yelled about my baby crying. He's alive because I'm a medic. The rhythmic, inconsolable wails of baby Leo had become the soundtrack to Sarah's life. He was 3 months old, a beautiful, bright-eyed boy with a surprisingly robust set of lungs, and he suffered from colic. The episodes were unpredictable, often striking in the late evenings or the early hours of the morning, transforming their cozy new apartment into a battleground of desperate soothing techniques and exhausted sighs. Sarah, a dedicated paramedic used to handling high-pressure situations, found herself humbled and occasionally overwhelmed by the relentless cries of her own child. Their recent move to the Willow Creek apartments had been driven by a need for more space and a fresh start. Sarah was a single mother, her partner having tragically passed away shortly before Leo's birth. The move was meant to be a step towards building a stable and supportive environment for her son. The complex seemed promising, clean, modern, and with a small community feel, at least on paper. Sarah had meticulously prepared their new apartment, creating a calm and nurturing space for Leo. The nursery was painted in soft blues and greens, filled with gentle mobiles and plush toys. She had researched every possible remedy for colic, from gentle rocking and warm baths to specialized gripe water and dietary adjustments. Some days were better than others, offering fleeting moments of peaceful cooing and contented naps. But then the storm of crying would return, leaving Sarah feeling frayed and helpless. She was a natural caregiver, her years as a paramedic honing her ability to remain calm and focused in the face of distress. She had witnessed countless medical emergencies, her training kicking in to assess situations, administer aid, and provide comfort in moments of crisis. Yet the persistent cries of her own child seemed to bypass her professional training, tapping into a primal vulnerability she had never known before. Their immediate neighbor in the Willow Creek apartments was a woman named Karen. Sarah had encountered her briefly during the move-in process. Karen lived alone in the meticulously decorated apartment next door, her pristine white door adorned with a tasteful, albeit somewhat impersonal, wreath. Her initial greeting had been a tight smile and a perfunctory, "Welcome to the building," delivered with an air that suggested Sarah's presence was being carefully evaluated. Karen was a woman who seemed to value order and tranquility above all else. Her appearance was always immaculate, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her clothes crisp and fashionable, her nails flawlessly manicured. She carried herself with an air of quiet authority, a subtle but unmistakable belief that her comfort and preferences should be prioritized. Sarah had initially dismissed her as simply reserved, focused on her own life. The reality, however, began to unfold within the first few days of their settling in. Leo's colic, unfortunately, made its presence known early and often. The thin walls of the apartment complex offered little in the way of soundproofing, and Leo's cries, especially during his more intense episodes, carried. The first sign of Karen's displeasure was a sharp rap on Sarah's shared wall late one evening. Leo had been particularly inconsolable, his cries escalating despite Sarah's frantic attempts to soothe him. The sudden banging startled both Sarah and Leo, momentarily silencing him before he erupted into an even more distressed wail. Sarah, her nerves already on edge, took a deep breath and went to her front door. She opened it to find Karen standing in the hallway, her face tight with annoyance, her arms crossed over her chest. She was wearing a silk dressing gown, and her perfectly styled hair looked slightly disheveled, suggesting Sarah had disrupted her evening. "Excuse me," Karen said, her voice low and sharp, "but do you have any idea how loud your baby is? Some of us are trying to sleep." Sarah's exhaustion warred with a surge of defensiveness. "I'm so sorry," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "He has colic. I'm doing everything I can to comfort him." Karen's expression didn't soften. "Well, you need to do something more. This is unacceptable. It's been going on for days." Sarah's patience began to fray. "He's a baby," she said, her voice rising slightly. "He cries. It's not something I can just switch off." "Other babies don't cry like that," Karen retorted, her tone accusatory. "Perhaps you should see a doctor, or maybe you're just letting him cry." The insinuation stung. Sarah had spent countless sleepless nights researching colic, trying every recommended remedy, her heart aching with helplessness as she tried to soothe her son. To have her parenting questioned by a neighbor who clearly had no understanding of the situation felt like a cruel blow. I am a single mother, Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. I am doing the best I can. And yes, I have consulted his pediatrician. This is colic, and it will pass. In the meantime, I would appreciate some understanding. Karen simply huffed. Understanding? I need to sleep. This is a quiet building. You're disturbing the peace. With that, she turned and retreated into her apartment, slamming her door shut. The encounter left Sarah feeling drained and resentful. She returned to Leo, who was still crying, her own frustration making it even harder to soothe him. The hope she had felt about their new beginning in Willow Creek Apartments began to dim, overshadowed by the immediate conflict with her demanding neighbor. The thin walls now felt like a constant source of anxiety, amplifying every one of Leo's cries into a potential trigger for another confrontation with Karen. The peace she had hoped for seemed a distant dream, replaced by the looming presence of an intolerant neighbor and the relentless reality of a baby with colic. The stage was set for an escalating conflict, fueled by sleepless nights, frayed nerves, and a fundamental lack of empathy. The initial confrontation with Karen set a chilling precedent for Sarah's life in Willow Creek Apartments. The thin walls became a constant reminder of her neighbor's intolerance, amplifying the already stressful reality of caring for a baby with colic. Every whimper, every escalating cry from Leo felt like a potential trigger for another sharp rap on the wall, or, worse, another direct and unpleasant encounter with Karen. Sleep, already a precious commodity for a new mother, became even more elusive, punctuated by the anxiety of disturbing her neighbor. Karen's complaints escalated quickly. The single sharp rap on the wall turned into a series of insistent bangs whenever Leo's crying persisted for more than a few minutes. Sarah tried to preempt the noise, rushing to soothe Leo at the first sign of distress, pacing the floor with him, humming lullabies until her throat was raw. But colic was an unpredictable beast, and sometimes nothing Sarah did seemed to quell Leo's cries. The direct confrontations also continued. Karen would intercept Sarah in the hallway, her face a mask of barely concealed irritation. Her complaints became more pointed, her tone more accusatory. "It's happening again," she would hiss, her voice low enough not to carry to other residents, but sharp enough to cut Sarah to the quick. "This is becoming unbearable. I can't get any peace in my own home." Sarah, often bleary-eyed and emotionally drained, tried to explain Leo's condition again, emphasizing that she was doing everything she could. She even shared information pamphlets on colic that her pediatrician had given her, hoping to offer Karen some understanding of the medical reality. Karen, however, remained unmoved. She would glance dismissively at the pamphlets, her expression conveying that Sarah's excuses held no weight. "Colic or not," she would retort, "you need to control your child. This is a quiet building, and your baby is disrupting everyone." The insinuation that Sarah was somehow failing as a mother, that she wasn't doing enough to soothe her own child, was particularly hurtful. As a paramedic, Sarah was trained to care for those in distress, to remain calm and effective in chaotic situations. The implication that she was incompetent in caring for her own son chipped away at her already fragile confidence as a new parent. Karen's complaints weren't limited to direct confrontations. Sarah soon received a formal notice from the building management, detailing complaints about excessive noise emanating from her apartment. The notice requested her immediate cooperation in resolving the issue, threatening further action if the noise persisted. Sarah was mortified. She scheduled a meeting with Mr. Henderson, again no relation to the others, the building manager, a kind but somewhat bureaucratic man. She explained Leo's colic, her efforts to manage it, and the constant pressure she was under from her neighbor. Mr. Henderson listened sympathetically, but his hands were tied by building regulations and the complaints from other residents, though Sarah suspected Karen was the primary, if not sole, source. He urged Sarah to find a solution, emphasizing the need to maintain a peaceful environment for all tenants. The pressure mounted on Sarah from all sides: the relentless crying of her son, the constant disapproval of her neighbor, and the looming threat of building sanctions. She felt increasingly isolated and helpless, trapped in a situation where she was being penalized for her baby's medical condition. In a desperate attempt to mitigate the noise, Sarah invested in thick, soundproofing curtains and rugs. She tried to confine Leo's crying spells to the nursery, closing the door and playing white noise in an attempt to muffle the sound. She even started taking Leo for long walks outside, hoping the fresh air and movement would soothe him, even if it meant sacrificing her own much-needed rest. Nothing seemed to satisfy Karen. The banging on the walls continued, sometimes even when Leo was only fussing quietly. The glares in the hallway became more intense, the muttered complaints more frequent. Sarah felt like she was living under constant scrutiny, her every move and every one of Leo's cries being judged and condemned. One particularly difficult afternoon, Leo had been crying inconsolably for over an hour. Sarah was pacing their small living room, rocking him, singing softly, tears of exhaustion and frustration welling in her own eyes. Suddenly, a furious pounding on the front door echoed through the apartment. Sarah reluctantly opened it to find Karen standing there, her face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "That's it!" she shrieked, her voice loud enough to carry down the hallway. "I have had enough. This incessant noise is ruining my life. I demand that you do something about that child right now." Sarah, pushed to her breaking point, finally snapped. "He has colic," she exclaimed, her own voice trembling with anger and exhaustion. "He's a baby. What do you expect me to do? Put him in a box?" "I expect you to be a responsible parent and control your child," Karen retorted, her eyes blazing. "This is a quiet building. You are inconsiderate and selfish." "Selfish," Sarah repeated, incredulous. "I haven't slept properly in 3 months. I'm doing everything I can. You have no idea what it's like." "Oh, I have a very good idea of what it's like to live next to a constant source of noise and disruption," Karen shot back. "You clearly have no respect for your neighbors." The argument escalated, the quiet hallway filled with the raw emotion of a sleep-deprived mother, pushed to her limit, and a neighbor consumed by her own intolerance. Other residents, drawn by the raised voices, began to peek out of their doors, witnessing the heated exchange. One neighbor, a young man named David who lived down the hall, finally intervened. "Karen," he said, his voice calm but firm, "Sarah is clearly having a difficult time. Maybe we can all try to be a little more understanding." Karen rounded on him, her anger undeterred. "Understanding? Why should I be understanding when she's making my life miserable?" The tension in the hallway remained thick, the neighbors caught in the middle of Sarah's desperate situation and Karen's unwavering demands. The incident left Sarah feeling even more isolated and targeted. It was clear that Karen's complaints were not just about the noise. They were rooted in a fundamental lack of empathy and a deep-seated intolerance for any disruption to her meticulously ordered life. The conflict continued to escalate in the following weeks. Karen began documenting every instance of Leo's crying, keeping a meticulous log of dates and times, which she regularly submitted to the building management. She even started recording the noise from her apartment, playing it back during meetings with Mr. Henderson as proof of the unbearable disruption. The building management, caught between a complaining resident and a struggling new mother, issued Sarah a final warning, threatening eviction if the noise did not cease. Sarah felt a surge of panic. The thought of being forced to move again, to uproot Leo and disrupt the fragile semblance of stability she was trying to build, was devastating. Desperate, Sarah reached out to a local support group for parents of babies with colic. She found solace in connecting with other mothers who understood the challenges she was facing. They offered advice, shared coping strategies, and most importantly, provided a sense of community and understanding that was sorely lacking in her interactions with Karen. One of the mothers in the group suggested mediation, a neutral third party helping to facilitate communication and find a resolution. Sarah, willing to try anything, proposed this to Karen. Karen, however, scoffed at the idea, dismissing it as a waste of her time. "There's nothing to mediate," Karen declared. "She needs to control her child. End of story." The impasse seemed unbreakable. Sarah felt trapped, her every effort to soothe her son met with disapproval and threats. The joy of motherhood was being overshadowed by the constant anxiety of her living situation, the relentless judgment of her neighbor, and the looming threat of losing her home. The conflict had reached a critical point, with Sarah feeling increasingly cornered and desperate for a solution. Then one ordinary afternoon, as Sarah was getting Leo ready for his nap, a series of frantic, muffled cries for help pierced through the thin walls. It was Karen's voice, and it sounded panicked and distressed. The relentless conflict between them was about to take a dramatic and unexpected turn. The muffled cries for help coming from Karen's apartment were starkly different from her usual sharp complaints. They were raw, filled with a genuine terror that cut through the thin walls, overriding even Leo's soft cooing as he finally drifted off to sleep. Sarah's paramedic instincts, honed by years of responding to emergencies, kicked in instantly. A cold dread washed over her, a primal sense that something was terribly wrong next door. Ignoring the lingering resentment from their constant conflict, Sarah's training took over. She carefully placed the sleeping Leo in his crib, her mind already racing through potential scenarios. A fall? A medical episode? The sheer panic in Karen's voice suggested something serious. Without hesitation, Sarah rushed to her front door and flung it open. The hallway was silent except for Karen's increasingly frantic calls for help, now punctuated by gasping breaths. Sarah followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest, and hammered on Karen's door. "Karen, it's Sarah. What's wrong?" The cries intensified, followed by a weak, "Help me. I can't breathe." Sarah didn't hesitate. Years of emergency response had taught her that every second counted. She tried the doorknob. Locked. With a surge of adrenaline, she braced her shoulder against the door and heaved. The flimsy lock splintered and the door flew inward. The scene that greeted Sarah was chaotic and terrifying. Karen was collapsed on her living room floor, her face pale and contorted in distress, her hands clutching at her chest. She was gasping for air, her breath shallow and wheezing. Her eyes were wide with panic, and a faint blue tinge was spreading around her lips. Sarah's paramedic training took over completely. The animosity between them vanished, replaced by the ingrained urgency to assess and treat. "Karen, I'm a paramedic. I'm going to help you. Tell me what happened." Karen could only manage short, broken sentences between gasps. "Chest, tight, can't breathe." Sarah quickly knelt beside her, her mind already running through a differential diagnosis. Asthma attack? Allergic reaction? Cardiac issue? She began her assessment, checking Karen's pulse, her breathing rate, and looking for any signs of injury or obvious triggers. "Do you have any medical conditions? Asthma? Allergies?" Sarah asked, her voice calm and authoritative, the professional demeanor Karen had never witnessed before. Karen shook her head weakly, her eyes pleading. "No, never. This..." Sarah's concern deepened. The rapid onset and severity of Karen's symptoms were alarming. The bluish tinge around her lips suggested hypoxia, a dangerous lack of oxygen. "I need to call 911 immediately," Sarah said, reaching for her phone. "Can you tell me your full name and address?" Karen managed to whisper the information as Sarah dialed emergency services, her voice relaying the critical details to the dispatcher, her training ensuring she provided clear and concise information. While waiting for the ambulance, Sarah began to provide basic first aid. She helped Karen sit up slightly, hoping to ease her breathing. She loosened any tight clothing around her neck and chest. She spoke to Karen in a calm and reassuring voice, trying to keep her conscious and focused. "Just try to take slow, deep breaths, Karen. I'm here. Help is on its way." Karen's eyes locked onto Sarah's face, a flicker of something akin to disbelief mixed with her obvious distress. This was the neighbor who had relentlessly complained about her baby's crying, the woman she had treated with such disdain. And now Sarah was her only lifeline. The irony of the situation hung heavy in the air, unspoken but palpable. The thin walls that had amplified Leo's cries had now carried Karen's desperate pleas for help to the one person in the building with the skills to potentially save her life. The minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Sarah continued to monitor Karen's condition, her paramedic training guiding her every action. She checked Karen's pulse and breathing repeatedly, prepared to perform CPR if her condition deteriorated further. Finally, the wail of sirens grew closer, and the paramedics arrived, bursting into Karen's apartment with their medical equipment. Sarah quickly briefed them on Karen's symptoms and the initial assessment she had conducted. The paramedics took over, administering oxygen and attaching monitors. Their movements were efficient and professional, a familiar ballet of emergency medical care that Sarah knew intimately. As they worked on Karen, stabilizing her and preparing her for transport to the hospital, Karen's eyes kept returning to Sarah, a silent acknowledgement of the unexpected intervention. Sarah followed the paramedics and Karen down to the ambulance, providing them with additional medical history and contact information. As they loaded Karen into the ambulance, her gaze met Sarah's one last time, this time holding a flicker of something that might have been gratitude, a stark contrast to the animosity she had displayed just hours before. Sarah watched the ambulance disappear down the street, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the emergency began to subside, leaving her feeling shaky and emotionally drained. The irony of the situation was now fully apparent, a bizarre twist of fate that had placed her, the target of Karen's relentless complaints, in the role of her Juxing. The following days were filled with a strange mix of emotions for Sarah. She was relieved that Karen had received medical attention, but the memory of their contentious relationship lingered. She wondered about Karen's condition, about what had caused her sudden respiratory distress. The other residents of Willow Creek Apartments, who had witnessed the heated arguments between Sarah and Karen, and then the dramatic arrival of the ambulance, were surprised to learn that Sarah had been the one to help Karen. Whispers circulated through the building, a dawning understanding of Sarah's profession and a quiet reassessment of Karen's behavior. A few days later, Mr. Henderson, the building manager, approached Sarah with a sheepish expression. He apologized for the pressure the building management had put on her regarding Leo's crying, admitting that they had primarily been reacting to Karen's persistent and often exaggerated complaints. He expressed his gratitude for Sarah's quick thinking and actions during Karen's emergency, acknowledging that she had potentially saved a life. The dynamic within the apartment complex began to shift. Neighbors who had previously avoided Sarah, unsure of the situation with Karen, now offered her tentative smiles and words of support. The relentless banging on the walls next door ceased. The tense atmosphere in the hallways began to dissipate. Then, a week after the emergency, Sarah received another unexpected visitor. It was Karen, looking pale and frail, but standing on her own 2 feet. She leaned heavily on a cane, and her voice was still weak, but her eyes held a newfound humility. "Sarah," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to thank you for everything." Sarah invited her in, a sense of cautious curiosity overcoming her lingering resentment. Karen slowly settled onto Sarah's sofa, her gaze sweeping over the small apartment, taking in the baby toys scattered on the floor and the framed photos of Leo. I don't remember much," Karen said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Just the tightness, not being able to breathe, and then you." Tears welled in Karen's eyes. You saved my life. After how I treated you, how I complained about your son." Sarah remained silent, allowing Karen to process her emotions. The irony of the situation was not lost on either of them. Karen continued, her voice filled with a raw vulnerability Sarah had never witnessed before. "I was so focused on my own comfort, my own peace and quiet, that I completely disregarded your struggles, your exhaustion, the fact that you were a single mother dealing with a sick baby." She looked at Sarah, her eyes filled with shame. "I was awful, truly awful." Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Leo's crying was stressful, Karen, but he's my son, and I am a paramedic. Helping people in need is what I do." Karen nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "I understand that now. More than you know. You showed me a kindness I didn't deserve." The conversation that followed was long and difficult. Karen spoke of her own loneliness, her rigid adherence to order, as a way to cope with her solitary life. She admitted that Leo's crying had felt like an unbearable intrusion into her carefully controlled world, blinding her to Sarah's pain. Sarah, in turn, spoke of the challenges of new motherhood, the exhaustion and worry that came with caring for a colicky baby, and the hurt she had felt by Karen's constant disapproval. It wasn't an instant forgiveness, but it was a start. A crack had appeared in the wall of animosity that had separated them, revealing a shared humanity beneath their vastly different experiences. In the weeks that followed, Karen's behavior underwent a significant transformation. The complaints about Leo's crying ceased entirely. Instead, Karen began to offer small gestures of support. A quiet offer to watch Leo while Sarah took a shower, a thoughtful gift of baby clothes, a genuine inquiry about Leo's well-being. The thin walls that had once been a source of conflict now seemed to carry a different kind of energy. The quiet sounds of a baby growing, punctuated by the occasional soft knock of a neighbor offering help. The climax of their conflict had not been a shouting match or a formal complaint, but a life-or-death emergency that had forced Karen to confront her own vulnerability and the unexpected kindness of the person she had treated with such disdain. The crying baby, once a source of her ire, had inadvertently become the catalyst for her transformation, a stark reminder that even in moments of frustration and conflict, the potential for compassion and understanding always exists.